I'd like to thank everyone so much for joining me today. And I'd like to send out a special thank you to Terry Farley and John Benedict. They have both been so helpful in this project. They have served as researchers, local contact for access to cemeteries, my support, and my guinea pigs for cemeteries in the Kerr County area. My purpose in this talk today is to share with you some research that the Texas Historical Commission has conducted over the last 30 years, combined with some scenarios that helped me understand historic cemeteries. Coming from an archaeology background, historic cemeteries were not something we were necessarily taught in school, and I learned my way through some interesting examples. I also want to train the trainers or teach the teachers. I want to spread the word so that if you are asked questions about cemeteries, cemetery law, cemetery preservation, that you know where to send the landowners, you know where to send cemetery associations, just as Terry and John have done in the Kerr County area. And I'm hoping to pique your interest in cemeteries, and especially in cemeteries as archaeological sites. I'm hoping to broaden your view of cemeteries from the large, organized cemetery in the middle of the city to the smaller, isolated, and even lost cemeteries. Because in the end, what I really hope is that you might be able to help me find lost cemeteries ahead of development. We need to find these cemeteries sooner than later, and we need to find them because we can't save a cemetery if we don't know where it is. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to talk about site development, the location of cemeteries, the evolution of a particular type of cemetery, and how a cemetery gets lost. Cemeteries as archaeological sites. I'm also going to talk about some specific observations of Kerr County cemeteries. I'll be covering basic cemetery law, which can be very boring, but anytime I have a captive audience, I like to share the very basics of cemetery law. And then I'll wrap up with the Texas Historical Commission Sites Atlas and how to record cemeteries. There's multiple different forms, and each form is useful in different situations. Cemeteries document homesteads, settlement patterns, rural communities, former communities, state hospitals, orphanages, even places that might have only been used temporarily, like railroad camps, lumber camps, and other industries where workers were buried. They document epidemics like yellow fever and cholera that may have had a devastating effect on small communities or completely wiped out a hospital or a camp. Cemeteries are archaeological sites. They're comprised of above and below ground evidence. They have features and artifacts, and these can be dated and studied as typologies that help us understand the culture and the time that they were used. Cemeteries reveal information about religions, lifestyles, and genealogy. The layout of a cemetery documents cultural associations, groupings, and segregations, who belongs in and who belonged out. This is an example of this photograph is a cemetery where a Protestant and a Catholic woman, a Protestant man and a Catholic woman were married, but were not allowed to be buried in the same cemetery. So they created their headstones to be joined hands for eternity. And the offerings or artifacts that people leave tell us about the people who loved them. Each cultural group has its own way of mourning and memorializing, and we need to respect that. This is one of my favorite cemeteries. This is St. Dominic Cemetery in Nearness. All of the features and artifacts within the cemetery make up these archaeological sites, from the site choice, the location, the layout or organization of the burials, the headstones, the fencing, the vegetation, which I call vegetative offerings. That's a special interest of mine, and I can give a talk just on the plants found within the cemeteries in Texas. And this is my favorite headstone The symbolism is just amazing. It's German, a heart, and it stands for, oh, now I'm not going to remember. I'm so sorry. Hope, charity, and religion. It also has the yellow rose of Texas and the star for Texas. So it's a merging of their German ancestry with their new life here in Texas. Real quick, I'm going to give you a little background on the Texas Historical Commission Cemetery Preservation Program. We were started in the 1980s when an architectural reviewer, Garen Height, received a lot of phone calls about how to preserve historic cemeteries. He asked the Texas legislature for funding for a cemetery preservation program, which started in 1998. In the early 2000s, Garen Height worked with a team of historians to develop the cemetery layer of the Texas Historical Commission's Sites Atlas. Today, we're a team of two. I kind of divide myself and Carlin's work as above ground and below ground. I, having a background in archaeology, I'm interested in the below ground, the features of the burial themselves, the burial shaft, what's in the grave. Carlin specializes in historic landscapes. She can help with headstone repair and general conservation of the whole landscape of the cemetery, the fences, and all the different aspects of the above ground features. In general, we both answer a lot of questions. We get sometimes 10 to 15 phone calls a day. We get usually, we're on the phone almost constantly throughout the day with just all kinds of questions about cemetery preservation, everything from do you have the combination to the gate to sort of support family therapy even at times. And Carlin also processes the historic Texas cemetery designations. So her plate is very full, my plate is very full. We estimate that there's about 50,000 cemeteries in Texas, of which we've only found about 20,000 of them. So we've got a lot of work to do. We know there's a lot of graves, unmarked graves, lost cemeteries out there yet to be discovered. I'm going to talk a little bit about site development, about how cemeteries are like our archaeological sites and how they evolved through time. Obviously, the earliest Anglo settlements in Texas, the majority of the cemeteries were rural. They were usually very, very close to the farm or ranch. And this was because they were using horse and wagons. They weren't going to carry their dead very far. It also might not have been safe for them to get very far away from their homesteads. And they would select hilltops for their cemeteries, probably to be closer to God. These prime locations were not available to the marginalized populations. African Americans and Mexican Americans might have had to choose whatever ground was gifted to them or that they could afford. For health reasons, the government encouraged grouping of cemeteries outside of towns, away from the water wells and cisterns. At that same time, around the 1880s, it was very popular, a philanthropic donation of land for a rural school, church, and cemetery. This was a major shift in cemeteries in Texas. Then again, near the turn of the century, the U.S. entered into the urban cemetery movement, where there were more park-like cemeteries, very large, planned, organized, and formal cemeteries. At the time, those were outside the city centers, but now they have been enveloped into the larger cities as we grow. So how do cemeteries get lost? Some of the actions are passive. Some are just a result of historic change, where some actions are more intentional. Some passive ways that cemeteries get lost would be a population moves with the railroad. And And later on, it moves again with the interstates. In the South, between 1916 and 1970, more than 6 million African Americans left for work opportunities in the North and in California, and to escape Jim Crow laws. So that change in culture is really important, and it's part of the dying off, part of the loss of the location of a lot of cemeteries. But there's also another part of our culture that has just changed recently. It is a mental idea of the importance of cemeteries, and that is quite literally the dying off of cemetery associations. It's the end of an era for homecomings, family reunions, decoration day, annual cemetery cleanups, and fundraisers. The loss of a cemetery can also be very active. Removal of cemeteries from maps, such as we find in the USGS maps. Right now, we're working with university interns to review old USGS maps, find cemeteries that were once marked on the maps and later were taken off. And what we find is that those cemeteries are of the marginalized populations, literally erased from the maps. Cemeteries drop out of deed records where they were recorded in the 1890s, 1900s, early 1900s. They are no longer kept in the deed records. So you have to go back to the earliest deed records to find out if there's a cemetery on your land. Many landowners would not allow access for visitors to maintain the cemeteries, and the overgrowth of the vegetation combined with just a loss of memory, not remembering how to get to the cemetery, or the death of ancestors who knew where the cemetery was. Moving headstones because somebody believes that the grave is no longer there. There's a belief that after 100 years, there simply was no more grave left and that the headstones could be moved anywhere. This particular image is permission by a county court, county commissioner's court, to relocate graves. And this example comes from the Stimson Cemetery in Collin County. Christopher Goodmaster, who will be conducting the remote sensing at the workshop coming up at the Texas Archaeology Society workshop, found this document. He was hired by a developer for a housing development to try to find the graves, knowing that the graves were somewhere on the property, but they did not know where. And he was able to identify the graves using remote sensing techniques. Next, I'm going to go through a series of slides that show the development of a cemetery. Say there's an individual who dies, maybe the grandfather or father of the landowner, that sort of thing. And that man's family wants to memorialize his grave and donate some land. And this is what happened in a small community in South Austin. It's now a park. And this is one of those examples that just opened my eyes to really understanding the evolution of a cemetery, and that they're not all the same, and they're not all the graves are not within a fence. Each cemetery sort of comes about in its own way. So they build a school, and the wealthy family gets a plot on the hilltop, and they decorate their grave site, their grave plots. Other people are buried in a different vicinity. Again, the wealthy section is embellished with trees and fencing. Possibly during the 1930s, but any other time, paupers were buried in a certain area. They couldn't afford formal headstones, so they're marked over here. In some religions, the babies are buried in one section of the cemetery. Perhaps this is in one of the corners. And so the cemetery grows. At some point, a road might come through, and we totally forget about the paupers' graves. What we have left is the footprint of the school, this very well marked wealthy family's graves, but no other graves. And I'm also often asked, how far away from the cemetery can we build? There's got to be a set number, right? There's got to be 10 feet away, 20 feet away. There is not a distance that I could tell you where on this 1 acre or 5 acres of land all of the graves are located. A second example of this is in Medina County. This is the Black Creek Cemetery near Divine. And each of these tree clumps represents a different cultural group. It happens to be a wealthy family in this area. I know this area is the Catholic section. I believe this section is the Methodist section. And I don't believe there's any known graves in this section, but there may be unmarked graves. So here's another example of how a cemetery evolved. And I think this was more common than not. They're not just going to start in the back of the cemetery and move forward, although in some Lutheran cemeteries they do exactly that. So cemeteries are not nice and neat, and they're not predictable as to where the graves are located. I want to switch over to some examples of cultural groups in Kerr County that Terry and John literally found these cemeteries. Obviously, the landowners probably knew they were there, but sometimes they didn't. And in this case, what I'm going to start with is the African American community. Lane Valley Cemetery number 1 and Lane Valley number 2, which is also called the Edmonds Blank Cemetery, as well as a third cemetery called the Blank Cemetery, represent small African American communities, probably a freedom colony. The headstones were marked with local limestone rocks, usually very few formal markers. When I talk about formal markers, I'm usually talking about marble markers that could be purchased through Sears and Roebuck or carved by a local craftsman. And in this case, you can see that this cemetery is simply out in the middle of a cow pasture. It is defined slightly by these cement corner posts, but there's just really, not much there culturally. And the African Americans were choosing these locations, given these locations for burial. In some cases, they did own the land. And as I mentioned, right around 1880 to the turn of the century, possibly pressurized by federal health and safety codes, the African American community needed to establish a new cemetery. This is the Tyvee Mountain Cemetery in Kerrville. It was established in 1903. And imagine trying to bury somebody in this rocky terrain. It's very difficult to access. You wouldn't be able to drive the hearse very far. You would be hauling the casket up this hill. Marking the graves would be difficult. There's erosion down the hill. It's dangerous. It's difficult to walk in. And on Find a Grave, it says that there's 225 graves, but only 35 have been documented, photographed. And most of those are funeral home markers. There's some that are poured concrete homemade markers, and even fewer formal markers. So one of the next cemeteries I went to visit with them was also African American. And this cemetery was established in the 1960s. It's manicured. It obviously has rules that enforce uniformity. It is lackluster in cultural features. When I looked at this cemetery, I was sort of sad. There just really wasn't a lot of cultural character. But when I looked at where they had been before and the difficulties that they had burying their dead in this terrain, I understood that might have been a choice to not have that difficulty, to not have that problem. Another example of a cemetery in Kerr County is the Kerr family plot. You can see this is also very uniform. The pink granite headstones are extremely culturally significant to the Germans. They associated with that pink granite being what the capital was built out of. I think it might have also been just very easily acquired. There was a lot of pink granite being quarried, so the availability was there. They had the technology to carve and inscribe the red granite at that point, the pink granite at that point. But my question when I saw this cemetery is, this is a ranching family, and the ranching family depended on workmen, herders, ranch workers, sheep shearers. And so my question when I look at this cemetery is, where are those workers buried? I know from my work in Menard County that a lot of the workers were Hispanic or Latin, and they may or may not have been Catholic. And so we need to start identifying the early Mexican American burials as well, burial places as well. This particular plot is in Mountain View, Kerrville's first cemetery. It was established in 1863, and it was early German cemetery. But if you can tell from this headstone, this is not German. It has been populated more recently with Mexican American burials, Latin American burials. And so we have this shift in an old Anglo cemetery to a primarily Latin American cemetery. Now I'm going to shift over to laws. What constitutes a grave? What's the legal definition of a cemetery? All graves are protected by law, but how are these things defined? And this is in the Texas Health and Safety Code. I'm going to go over some laws pretty quickly. It's very dry. It's important information, but I want you to know that you can find it on the Texas Historical Commission's webpage, which I'll share at the end of the presentation. So a grave is a space of ground that contains interred human remains, and it's used or intended to be used for the interment of those remains in the ground. Two things I want to point out. The human remains are interred. They're not on the surface. They're not, somebody dug a hole and put them in. And also that it was used or intended to be used. So it can also be land that was set aside, intended to be used as a cemetery. Property is considered to be dedicated cemetery land if one or more human burials are present, or if it is dedicated in the records to be used. Hold on, I'm gonna tell somebody to stop doing something real quick. I apologize. So it's either set aside in the deed record or there's graves present. There doesn't need to be a particular record or instrument or ceremony that says that it's a cemetery. It's just the presence of those graves that makes it a cemetery. Once a cemetery is dedicated, it cannot be used for any other purpose unless the dedication is removed. And that is a process through the district court to remove the dedication of cemetery. The Texas Historical Commission does not have law enforcement authority. This falls to the local county sheriff or municipal police department. So we can't help you enforce these laws. You may need to contact law enforcement. Just a few more. Any person who wishes to have access to a cemetery, if you want to visit a cemetery, you should have the legal right to do so. The landowner has their rights as well. They may designate a route, reasonable hours. They may have to provide written notice to the owners, and they may have to provide that notice within 14 days of their planned visit. So there are rights both on the visitor side and on the landowner side. Now this says any person. It doesn't say a descendant. It doesn't say a historian. It says any person who wishes to visit a cemetery. And finally, who owns a cemetery? This is something I was sort of taught to say when I came to the Texas Historical Commission. I didn't quite understand. I'd get a lot of phone calls about who owns the cemetery. And a landowner could own the land, could hold title to the land that a cemetery is on, but they are limited with what they can do with the land. They cannot destroy the land. They can't use it for any other purposes, and they can't prohibit access to the cemetery. So the Texas Historical Commission keeps a listing, a big map, the atlas of sites in the states. In the state, we have museums, historic neighborhoods, National Register sites, and cemeteries. There's a protected layer that also has archaeological sites. Right now we have just under, there's too many zeros there. Just under 16,000 cemeteries in the database, of which only about 12,500 are mapped. So that tells you that we've got a lot of cemeteries that we don't really even know where they're located. But then we have some cemeteries called vicinities, where I know there's something on the McDaniels Ranch or in the small community of such and such, but I don't know where that cemetery is in that area. And that's some of the sites that I'm hoping that we'll be finding with the help of archaeology stewards, our history stewards, and county historical commissions. So these are some of the places that I'm really hoping I'll be able to actually put the dot on the map. The other thing I wanted to say about the atlas is that just like a county planner, this is the state's cultural resource map. Preservationists and government-based contracted planners use this atlas to identify locations of cultural resources during the early planning stages of infrastructure and development projects like TxDOT. So we really want to make sure that the cemeteries are plotted on this atlas ahead of time, so that they know not to put a road through there or not to build over a cemetery. I tend to not use, this is the main page of the atlas. I tend to not use this page. The reason is because many of the cemeteries in our atlas are not named by a name that you might call it. They might be unknown names, or they might be a name that you might not know it as. I prefer to use the second tab over, which is the map, and to pan around the atlas to try to find the locations to see if we know that it's mapped or not. I encourage you to look for cemeteries on the atlas, and if you find them, oh, I didn't include that slide. If you find them, you can tell me about them through email, or through the atlas has a button called Report an Error. So the cemeteries on the atlas were first placed there. The first attempt to locate all of the cemeteries in Texas was the use of USGS, U.S. Geological Survey maps. A man spent 5 years in the basement mapping 4,000 USGS maps to try to identify the most cemeteries that we could. Later, an archival survey was done where historians went to county historical commissions and looked at their county inventories, looked at old county highway maps. Later, the Record, Investigate, Protect survey went out and had boots on the ground, as they called it, looking for and recording these cemeteries. We also have the Historic Texas Cemetery designation, which we have about 2,300 of at this point in time. That's a very good way to record a cemetery. It includes deed research, photographs, maps, and I'm going to talk just a little bit more about recording cemeteries next. There's also new county inventories, along with my work with trying to find some of the vicinities, the cemetery vicinities. There's a form called a Notice of Existence of Cemetery, Notice of Existence of Abandoned or Unknown Cemetery, of which we have about 420 filed. There's a somewhat newer concept called Notice of Unverified Cemetery, and an unverified cemetery is a place where you have some evidence of there being a grave or graves. You might have a headstone leaning up against a tree, or headstones leaned up against a fence line. You might have something that looks like a headstone that says Buddy on it, and you're not sure if Buddy is a person or a horse or a dog. You might just have a rock cairn, a mound of rocks in the shape of a grave, and you're not sure if that's a human grave or a push pile, like a backhoe push pile or that sort of thing. And then finally, there's archaeological site recording, which many of the members of this audience probably are most familiar with the archaeological site record forms. So just a few more slides and then we'll get to questions. The different ways to record a cemetery. I like to divide this between what is public and what is protected. What is just stored in the archaeology division at the Texas Historical Commission versus what's on public record in the county clerk's office. Sometimes when you record a cemetery, you want it to be public. Sometimes when you record a cemetery, especially if you're not sure if it's a human grave or not, you want it to be protected. So when to use an archaeological site form only, I would say that's when you're conducting investigations, when you're using remote sensing at a cemetery, when you're collecting data that maybe a future archaeologist might need to know about. Scraping, looking for graves. I would record those on archaeological site form because we want future archaeologists to know that you've already done this work. That's where they're going to go look for it. If there's evidence of a cemetery, but there's no proof of the exact location or no proof that it's a human grave, you would use a Notice of Unverified Cemetery form. And that would be a fine place to also put on an archaeological site form. If you're recording that area for another purpose, you would record it on the archaeological site form that you think there might be a grave or there's some headstones leaning up against a fence. Those are things that you would mention on the site form. The bottom two, Notice of Existence of Abandoned and Unknown Cemetery and the Historic Texas Cemetery designation, are actually recorded in the clerk's office. So this is a public record. In some cases, you want to tell the clerk and the landowner that you know that there's a grave on their property and you're recording this form, and you want them to know you're recording this form. You're kind of making them aware that you're aware of a cemetery on their land. If the cemetery is not in the atlas, if it's not mapped, if it's not known, that's a good time to use the Notice of Existence of Cemetery form. The Historic Texas Cemetery designation form is about 4 pages plus a history. It's a very thorough recording form. It's a good template to keep around in the same way that you just write your notes in the field. It's a reminder of things to look for, curbing, flagpoles, benches, what type of headstone, what material are the headstones made out of? Are there roads, paths, vegetation, cultural vegetation? So it's just something to keep in your back pocket, to use when you're recording cemeteries, to remember all the different features within a cemetery. And it records deed. It also includes doing some deed research, some map research, and it asks for specific photographs. So, like I said, it's just a good template. It's a prerequisite for a historical marker. So if you want a historical marker for a cemetery, you would need to file or apply for the Historic Texas Cemetery designation first. Any cemetery that's 50 years old or older can be designated, and the process takes about 4 months to go through. That's completely separate from the marker program. The marker program is a completely separate step. And finally, I want to talk to you just real briefly about my work with the vicinity cemeteries. There were about 4,000 maps in my office when I came in about 8.5 years ago, and they were ready to throw these maps out. And I realized that these had hand-drawn notes, and that we were about to lose the locations or loose the locations of these cemeteries. And so I mapped them onto the protected layer of the atlas. I did this because these are not known places. We don't know where the cemetery is. We need to find them. And so if archaeologists are working in the area, they can write to me and ask for more details. I can tell them what evidence I have, where it was referenced, and then hopefully they can go and look. I do have my first success story. I've had several success stories where the graves were actually moved, and that's okay. It's good to know where the graves used to be. But in this case, I had a vicinity circle near San Marcos, and a sand quarry company hit a grave. They called the sheriff, and the sheriff called Texas State University's forensic lab, who went out to document, to make sure it wasn't a forensic case. It turned out to be the grave of Captain William Holt. And as we were digging through the backfill pile of bones that were very disturbed, we found that it was actually two individuals. It was Mr. Holt and his wife. Mr. Holt died in 1855. His wife was buried in 1880. So I'm happy to say that this is working. It will be a slow process. It will not happen overnight. It will take years and years and years to find some of these places, but I'm happy with the results so far. This is a THC cemetery preservation webpage. We have all kinds of information. All the laws are on here. You can download preservation handouts. You can reach us. You can look for cemeteries on the atlas through this webpage. And for the most part, that wraps up my talk. But I do want to talk about the TAS workshop really quickly. It'll be either 1, 2, or 3 days, depending on what you want to learn and what you want to participate in. It is closed at this point. We were expecting a handful of interested attendees, and we're up to almost 90 now. And it's just physically too difficult to work with a number that large. We will not be able to be moving them to small cemeteries. And so we'll be capping the registration. I'll be sending out a poll, an email poll, asking registrants what they're interested in learning, and I'll be getting back to them before field school. So that's where we're at with the TAS workshop, the field school workshop. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go to question and answer, question time, and see who's awake.
Yeah.
So if you can unmute the participants. participants, the attendees. Do I have any questions? Jenny, can you please move your microphone closer to you? So sorry.
Yeah.
It's what the state gave me. Carolyn? So she's muted. Somebody needs to unmute everyone.
Okay, Jenny, I have a question.
Well, Carolyn has a question, but she's muted.
This is John Forrester. Can you hear me?
Carolyn's going to ask a question first.
Okay.
If a cemetery is like undedicated for some reason, you talked about that, do the remains have to be removed?
Yep.
They do.
Yes. If a developer wants to build where is a cemetery, they hire an archaeologist or a funeral director, have the graves disinterred. There's only certain places that they can move those graves to, and that's all at their expense. So I estimate, even though this is a very, very rough number, it's about $8,000 per grave. And if you only have 3, a developer is not going to blink an eye at that. If you have 3 headstones but 30 graves, they're going to start thinking twice about their development plan. Okay, Forrester.
Okay. My question has to do with Lake Travis and the construction of that reservoir and the, I guess it's the LCRA, moved graves from along the river up to White Rock Cemetery on 71. And they didn't mark the graves. In particular, this is like Loman's Crossing. I'm a descendant of that family. And I went out to that cemetery and there were no graves marked. Is that recorded anywhere where the graves are?
So what was required in the 40s and 50s might not be what's required today.
Okay.
There should be an archaeological investigation. It might be minimal, and I would imagine that LCRA would have the records.
Okay. That's where I'll check.
And I might be able to help you with that if you call me or
Okay.
email me. I might be able to connect you with somebody who might be able to find a report. And it may be that we have to go to the notes of the archaeologists at Tarl rather than whatever got published.
I see.
Again, it's the timing. And a lot of the laws that we have are in place because of communities like this were lost. So, you know, when communities said that's not right, that's not fair, sure, you can move them, but we need to know who's where and that sort of thing. Then the archaeologists were able to do more work before they moved them.
Sure. Okay.
Mike is talking, but he's muted.
I think Pam had her hand up.
Yes, actually, this has to do with this field school that you've been discussing. My husband and I live on Bear Creek Road, sort of between Ingram and Kerrville. And we got in our mailbox a notice from a Mr. Steve Stoudemeyer.
Right.
All right, I just wanted to, we've responded to that positively. We'd like to have our property surveyed during that time frame. And thank you very much for the explanation of what's going to happen. We volunteered without really knowing what was going on, but it sounded, the notice he left us was very interesting, very thorough. So
that's actually a little bit separate. During the Texas Archaeology Society's field school, there'll be multiple things going on. There'll be excavations of a prehistoric site, excavations at a historic site. There'll be the cemetery workshop, and then there'll also be survey where a crew comes to your land and looks for archaeological sites. They'll ask you if you found these arrow points or other things on your property, but they'll survey the rest of the land. And so that's the survey is what you got the mailing about.
All right, thank you. Yep.
Any other questions?
Anybody else?
I'm going to take this pause as an opportunity until somebody thinks of a question to give a serious high five to Terry Farley and John Benedict, because they have been out there in the trenches, in the records, in the fields, looking for these cemeteries, and they've done great work, and they've been an immense help.
Thank you, Jenny. But Terry's the one that's really responsible for most of what's happening there.
Yes.
She's carrying a huge load.
Well, John, now you're being very modest. You are the one who taught me a lot, and I'm so grateful. If anybody would love to help clear a couple of cemeteries, we could use some hands on deck. And I'm talking about cutting down vegetation so that remote sensing can be done in the very, very near future. So if it's something that you would enjoy doing and getting to see two very interesting cemeteries, you can give me a call. And I'm going to go out on a limb and give my phone number because we need some help. It's 830-496-0531. And if you're willing to come out with a weed eater or trimming, we could use your help. It would be great. Thank you.
Jenny, I have a question. Then my son just bought a house in a brand new subdivision, and all his neighbors were talking about the cemetery at the back of the subdivision. So of course my ears perked up, and apparently there was, when the developer bought the land, there was a marked cemetery called the Voges Family Cemetery. This is in Guadalupe County.
Oh, I know.
Oh, okay. And the developer moved the graves to San Geronimo Cemetery, but the family wasn't consulted, apparently. What recourse is there for the family? The descendants apparently were very unhappy.
Yes, I know. So the way that the law is stated, a landowner, so the person who has purchased the property, can petition the district court to have the graves moved. The process also asks that the Texas Historical Commission and the local county historical commission are consulted. I believe they were, but then whose job is it to find the family? In my opinion, it's the developer's job to find the family. It's not spelled out so that they have to. I would hope, and I think Guadalupe County has learned a lot from this, and I'm not pointing fingers, but it's a difficult position to be put in, that they all of a sudden up and start finding descendants of the Voges family. But that is kind of the role of the local county historical commission, to have a voice. They've been given the opportunity to have a voice, and finding the descendants would be a good way to go. To put it lightly, the Texas Historical Commission doesn't necessarily have a lot of teeth in the law. We're probably not going to go out on a limb. If nobody tells us they're upset, we don't know they're upset. So in that case, nobody told the family. It's also a good example as to why we need to be watching our cemeteries. We need signage. We need contact information. We need to visit them. We need to make sure that they're in the appraisal district records. We need to make sure that they have tax exempt forms filed for them. That's a new one on me. I just found out a week and a half ago that yes, the law states that a cemetery is exempt from taxation. The tax law says there has to be a form filed in order to be exempt. and it says that the landowner has to file it. So who files for the thousands and thousands of cemeteries that were churches that have moved or went away or disintegrated? Who files for the families who no longer have descendants? Who files for the dead? And I'm not quite sure how to get the word out on that. So there you go.
That sounds really fascinating. Somebody could claim that there's a large piece of their property that has cemeteries on it. How do you define the size of that area that's a cemetery?
Right.
I mean, it would be attractive to make a very large area on your property, a cemetery, and make it exempt.
I have seen that.
Yeah.
I have seen that used in both ways, but now there are the saddest part is that a lot of the cemeteries that were African American were part of that school, church, and cemetery that was set aside. Well, it's recorded as one thing, a school, church, and cemetery. They see the word school when we desegregated and the African American children went to the white school because the white children were not going to the black school. That land just went into the ISD. Well, now the ISD wants money, and that nobody's paid any taxes on that. And so they sell it off as 3 acres that used to be a school.
Mm.
People are buying these at auction, sight unseen.
That's crazy.
I've had 3 examples in the last 2 months.
There's a cemetery said to be in existence here in Kendall County on private property. And I and several others have tried to contact the landowner and get permission to get on and ground truth the presence of those gravestones, but we can't seem to get on and get the job done. And as you say, there's not any real teeth in the law that will allow us to get on unless we contact the sheriff or do something else in a legal manner. I don't know. It's a little frustrating. I'm wondering if you have some suggestions or solutions.
I do have an email template that I send to people who are having trouble accessing their cemeteries, and I'm happy to share it. It basically says that here's the law. You mail this law to them. You explain you want to be on this date. You send it in certified mail, and I'll email you all of this. And you do that again, and then you copy the sheriff's department and hope that weight carries a little bit more. And if the local law enforcement doesn't want to help, I can't do anything at that point either.
Sure.
I have been in a civil case where it was mediated and I was able to sit in Gillespie County, where the descendants were not allowed on the land for 40 years and brought it to court. It was settled out of court, but brought the case, hired attorneys. And in the end, the landowners were only going to let the family on twice a year. But the family didn't feel that was enough. And in the end, an easement was granted because the cemetery was only about 200 feet off of a county road. So they didn't have very much land they needed to cross. They weren't going far back onto the property.
Right.
And so they were literally given this narrow car width easement to get from the county road to the cemetery. And the family was required to fence the cemetery to keep the cattle out of the cemetery and out of the easement. But in the end, they got 365 days a year whenever they wanted to visit. So
that's a great solution.
Yeah. But, had it been further back on the ranch, it would have been a lot harder. The location was helpful. John, send me an email to remind me to send you that access template.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for your interest.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny.
Yeah, excellent talk.
Thank you.
Wonderful job, Jenny. Thank you very, very much.
And thank you for the ladies with the DANR for attending. Please reach out to me if you have questions, or if we can involve the DAR in specific projects.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you again, Jenny. We really appreciate it. We finally got this program done, which is really, really important, especially with the workshop coming up and everything. So we'll go ahead and adjourn. Thanks, everybody, for attending. Our visitors, if you want to know a little bit more about what we do, our website is pretty complete with our information. And we've got folks that are in-house that will certainly answer questions back to you if you do get a hold of us. So I guess we're adjourned. Hopefully we'll see y'all in July at the Union Church in Kerrville. Get back together, and we're very much looking forward to that. So I guess we're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.